It is October 14th, 1944. In a quiet village in southern Germany, a 15-year-old boy named Manfred stands in the hallway of his home. He is wearing the uniform of a Luftwaffe anti-aircraft auxiliary. Standing in front of him is his father, but his father is no ordinary man. He is Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the most famous, most respected, and most mythologized general in the entire German military. Rommel is wearing his Africa tunic. He looks deeply tired. For weeks, he has been recovering at home after his staff car was strafed by an Allied fighter plane in France. But now the war has come directly to his front door. Outside, parked in the driveway, is a black Mercedes. Inside that car sit two SS generals sent personally by Adolf Hitler. Rommel places his hand on his 15-year-old son's shoulder. He does not give a grand speech. He does not speak of victory. Instead, with a cold and terrifying finality, he tells his son, "In a quarter of an hour, I shall be dead." Then he explains the ultimatum. Because he has been implicated in the July 20th assassination plot against Hitler, he has been given a choice. He can face a public show trial that will end with his execution by hanging, and his family, his wife Lucy, and his son Manfred will be sent to a concentration camp and murdered. Or he can get into the black car, take a cyanide pill, and be granted a hero's state funeral. If he chooses poison, Hitler promises that Lucy and Manfred will be fully protected and given a full state pension. Rommel puts on his heavy leather overcoat. He picks up his field marshal's baton. Then he walks out the door. About 15 minutes later, the telephone rings. The hospital informs Lucy Rommel that her husband has suffered a sudden brain hemorrhage. That is the official lie. That is the story the regime tells the world. History books love to dwell on the military campaigns of the Desert Fox, but they almost always stop on the day he took that cyanide pill. For Lucy and for their teenage son Manfred, however, the story did not end in 1944. In many ways, it was only beginning. Surviving the collapse of the Third Reich as the family of a murdered icon was its own nightmare. And what followed? What happened after the funeral processions ended and the speeches died away became one of the most remarkable untold stories of the post-war era. It is the story of how the Rommel name was dragged out of the ashes of Nazi Germany and transformed, painfully and slowly, into a symbol of democracy, peace, and reconciliation. Imagine the psychological torture forced upon 15-year-old Manfred and his mother Lucy. Just days after Rommel's death, the Nazi regime staged a massive, opulent state funeral for the Desert Fox. His coffin, draped in the swastika, was paraded through the streets. Senior Nazi officials delivered grand speeches praising Rommel's unbreakable loyalty to the Führer. And there stood Lucy and Manfred, right in the front row. They had to shake hands with the very SS officers who had delivered the poison to their husband and father. They had to nod. They had to weep at the proper moments. They had to accept the condolences of a government they knew had just murdered the head of their family. And they knew one thing with absolute certainty. If they spoke a single word of truth to anyone, the Gestapo would have them executed. So they lived in sheer terror. Manfred, despite knowing that the regime had killed his father, was still swallowed by the dying German war machine. As the Allies pushed into Germany in the spring of 1945, the 16-year-old was drafted into the Volkssturm, the desperate civilian militia ordered to fight the Americans and the French to the last man. But by then, Manfred had learned one final lesson from his father. The war was lost. Throwing your life away for a madman was not honor. It was madness. So when the French First Army swept into southern Germany, Manfred Rommel deserted. He threw away his weapon. He walked toward the Allied lines, and he surrendered. When he arrived at an Allied prisoner of war camp, he was interrogated by French and American intelligence officers. One can only imagine the expressions on their faces when a skinny, exhausted 16-year-old boy looked at them and said that his name was Manfred Rommel. The Desert Fox's son was now an Allied prisoner. Yet that captivity would become one of the keys to exposing one of the greatest secrets of the war. When the war officially ended, Germany lay in ruins. Lucy Rommel was now living in the French occupation zone, struggling to survive in a shattered economy, just like millions of other German women. But she was not merely trying to survive. She had a mission. During the Nuremberg trials, the world was finally learning the full horror of the Nazi regime. But the official historical record still claimed that Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had died of natural causes resulting from his combat wounds. That lie still stood. Then Lucy and Manfred, after his release from the prisoner of war camp, finally broke their silence. They stepped forward and revealed the truth. They revealed the cyanide pill. They revealed the black Mercedes. They revealed the brutal ultimatum delivered in Hitler's name. The revelation sent shockwaves through Allied intelligence circles. The fact that Hitler had murdered his own most popular general shattered the illusion of a unified Nazi high command. It exposed the rot at the core of the regime even more clearly. And Lucy was not finished. She took a decisive step to secure her husband's historical legacy. During the war, she had secretly hidden Erwin Rommel's massive collection of personal diaries, combat maps, and letters. She had buried them in concealed locations so the Gestapo would never find them. Now, after the fall of the Third Reich, those buried papers were no longer just private memories. They were evidence. They were history waiting to speak. After the war, Lucy Rommel began the long and painful work of restoring the truth. She worked with the famous British military historian B.H. Liddell Hart. Together, they gathered Erwin Rommel's buried writings and compiled them into a book called The Rommel Papers, published in 1953. That book changed how much of the world viewed the North African campaign. It helped cement the post-war image of Rommel as the noble adversary, a commander of great brilliance who refused to commit war crimes, refused to execute prisoners of war, and in the end defied Hitler himself. Modern historians would later debate the full complexity of Rommel's relationship with the regime. They would question where duty ended and complicity began. But for Lucy, this was never an academic exercise. It was an act of devotion. It was a battle against the official Nazi lie. And in that battle, she succeeded in clearing her husband's name from the false narrative created around his death. Lucy Rommel then lived a quiet and private life in Stuttgart until she passed away in 1971. She had preserved the truth. She had protected the documents. She had carried the burden of silence, and then, when the time came, broken it. But after her death, the future of the Rommel name rested entirely on the shoulders of her son. And Manfred Rommel was about to step onto the world stage. He could have chosen a very different path. He could have capitalized on his father's military fame. He could have entered the new West German army, the Bundeswehr, and very likely fast-tracked his way toward becoming a general. The name alone would have opened doors. The legend alone would have carried weight, but Manfred wanted nothing to do with war. He had seen the final price of militarism with his own eyes. He had watched it destroy his country. He had watched it murder his father. He had lived through the lies, the fear, the coercion, the collapse. He did not want command. He did not want uniforms. He did not want battle. Instead, he chose a different road. He studied law and political science at the University of Tübingen. He was brilliant, intensely thoughtful, and known for a dry, self-deprecating wit. He joined the Christian Democratic Union, the CDU, a center-right political party committed to rebuilding West Germany into a peaceful, democratic, and economically powerful nation. Manfred Rommel represented a completely different type of German leadership. Where his father had been a stern and rigid Prussian military figure, the son was a pragmatist. He was known for tolerance. He was known for humor. He was known for a deep belief in civil rights and democratic responsibility. He once summed up that difference with a line that captured his entire public identity. "I am not my father. I do not command tanks. I command paperwork." That sentence said everything. In 1974, Manfred Rommel ran for mayor of Stuttgart, one of the largest and most industrially vital cities in West Germany. He did not hide his surname, but he did not run on it either. He did not present himself as the son of a legend. He presented himself as a serious, capable, modern political leader. And the people of Stuttgart saw exactly that. They saw integrity, they saw intelligence, they saw steadiness, and they elected him mayor in a landslide. What followed was extraordinary. Manfred Rommel would hold that office for 22 years. Over that time, he became one of the most beloved and widely respected politicians in modern German history. But his greatest test would not come from budgets, factories, or city development. It would come from terror, from rage, from the demand for vengeance. In the autumn of 1977, West Germany was seized by fear. A violent, far-left communist terror group known as the Red Army Faction, also called the Baader-Meinhof Gang, was assassinating German politicians, bombing buildings, and hijacking airplanes. Their goal was to destabilize the democratic state. The leaders of that terror group had been captured and locked inside the maximum security Stammheim prison, located directly in Manfred Rommel's city of Stuttgart. Then, in October of 1977, after a failed airplane hijacking intended to force their release, the three ringleaders of the group committed suicide in their prison cells. And suddenly the country exploded. The families of the dead terrorists requested that the three leaders be buried together in the main public cemetery in Stuttgart. The public backlash was immediate and furious. Many citizens and many powerful politicians were enraged. They argued that terrorists who had murdered innocent Germans did not deserve burial in a city cemetery. Some demanded unmarked graves. Others demanded the bodies be thrown into the sea. Some wanted them buried in a landfill. The decision landed squarely on the desk of Mayor Manfred Rommel. From a purely political standpoint, the easy answer was obvious. Deny the burial. Refuse the request. Give the angry public exactly what it wanted. Manfred was a conservative politician. He despised everything the terrorists stood for. He had no sympathy for their ideology, no softness toward their violence, no illusions about the blood on their hands. And yet he chose a different path. He remembered what hatred had done to Germany. He remembered what happened when states abandoned human dignity. He understood, perhaps more deeply than most, what began to happen when revenge became policy and rage became law. He had seen where that road led in the 1940s, and he would not let a democratic Germany walk it again. So Manfred Rommel approved the public burial. The criticism was intense. The press attacked him. Many were outraged. But standing before the microphones, Mayor Rommel responded with one of the most powerful statements in post-war German public life. He said, "All enmity must end at the grave. A democratic state must be able to bury its dead, even its most bitter enemies, in a dignified manner. We must not allow the hatred they practice to dictate the rules of our society." That was not weakness. That was moral strength. It was a lesson in democratic leadership. By refusing to sink to the level of the terrorists, the son of the Desert Fox showed that West Germany was no longer a state built on vengeance. It was a state built on the rule of law. In that moment, Manfred Rommel proved that true political courage is not only the courage to punish, sometimes it is the courage to restrain. The courage to uphold principles when anger demands surrender. The courage to defend dignity, even when the dead are hated. And for that, he earned immense international respect. But perhaps the most astonishing chapter of Manfred Rommel's life was still ahead, because the next transformation of the Rommel name would not happen in courtrooms or city hall. It would happen across old battle lines, across old graves, across the memory of a war that had once set entire nations against one another. During the Second World War, Erwin Rommel's two greatest battlefield rivals were the British Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, who defeated him at El Alamein, and the flamboyant American General George S. Patton, who raced against him across North Africa and Europe. In the minds of soldiers who had lived through those campaigns, these names belonged to opposite worlds. They were symbols of collision, destruction, and total war. If someone had told a soldier in 1943 that the families of those three men would one day sit together in the same room, not as enemies but as friends, he would have called it madness. And yet that is exactly what happened. Decades after the war, Manfred Rommel received a letter. It came from David Montgomery, the son of the British Field Marshal. The two men met, and against all odds, they became close friends. Their connection was not built on old strategy maps or battlefield pride. It was built on something much more personal and much more human. Both men understood what it meant to live in the shadow of a giant. Both knew the strange burden of carrying a surname that belonged not only to a family, but to history itself. They shared a loneliness that almost no one else could understand. Soon after, they reached out to Major General George Patton IV, the son of the famous American general. Then something extraordinary took shape. The three men, Rommel, Montgomery, and Patton, formed a genuine bond. They met often. They shared dinners. They attended historical commemorations together. They laughed together. They spoke not as heirs to old hatred, but as men who had inherited memory and chosen not to be imprisoned by it. Just imagine that image for a moment. The son of Germany's most famous tactician, the son of Britain's wartime hero, the son of America's most aggressive battlefield commander, sitting at the same table, sharing a drink, smiling, treating one another like brothers. For millions of veterans who had fought in the scorching sands of North Africa and the freezing snows of the Ardennes, that image carried enormous power. To see Rommel, Patton, and Montgomery publicly embracing one another was to witness something larger than symbolism. It was proof that the deepest wounds of the Second World War did not have to remain open forever. It was proof that reconciliation, even after catastrophe, was possible. That may have been the most remarkable triumph of Manfred Rommel's life. Not military glory, not inherited fame, but reconciliation, the transformation of memory into understanding, the refusal to let the past demand endless revenge. Manfred Rommel served as mayor of Stuttgart until he retired in 1996. By then, he had helped transform the city into an economic powerhouse, a center of culture, and a bastion of tolerance. He was not simply a successful mayor. He had become a public figure, admired far beyond Germany, a man whose life represented the moral reconstruction of a nation that had once torn the world apart. For his work in Anglo-German reconciliation, he was awarded the Commander of the Order of the British Empire, one of the highest honors Britain can bestow upon a foreign citizen. That honor alone says almost everything. The son of a German field marshal, decorated by Britain for helping heal the divide left by war. History rarely offers a more striking image than that. Manfred Rommel died in 2013 at the age of 84, surrounded by his family. And when we step back and look at the full story of the Rommel family, what remains is something deeper than a military biography. It is not merely the story of a famous commander. It is the story of the people left behind after the uniforms are gone, after the speeches fade, after the armies collapse, after the flags fall into dust. It is the story of those who must live among the ashes and decide what comes next. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's legacy will always be debated. Historians will continue to wrestle with the contradictions. He was a brilliant commander. He served a monstrous regime. He was a man trapped between duty as a soldier and conscience as a human being. In the end, that tension cost him his life. But the legacy of his family stands on firmer ground. Lucy Rommel fought the Gestapo, fought silence, and fought history itself to make sure her husband was not erased beneath a lie. She preserved the papers. She preserved the truth. She protected memory when memory itself was dangerous. And Manfred Rommel did something perhaps even harder. He took one of the most famous war-marked names of the 20th century and spent his entire life trying to wash the blood from it. Not through denial, not through propaganda, not through borrowed glory, but through law, dignity, public service, and peace. The Desert Fox mastered the art of war. His son achieved something far more difficult. He mastered the art of peace. And that may be the most powerful post-war story of all, because it reminds us that history is not finished when the guns fall silent. The final battle often begins afterward, inside families, inside memory, inside broken nations, struggling to choose between bitterness and reconciliation. The ones who win that battle do not always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear grief. Sometimes they carry silence. Sometimes they spend an entire lifetime proving that a name born in war can still be redeemed in peace.